I believe that Ralph Metzner is one of those people who's been changing the world for a long time. So I'm very excited that we'll get a chance to hear his continuing change tonight. But I'm excited first to introduce you to Janice Phelps. Janice is a longtime faculty member at CIIS. She's also a former Dean of Faculty and the current Director of the Center for Psychedelic Therapies and Research, which is co-sponsoring this event with Public Programs Performances. So please join me in welcoming Janice Phelps.
Thank you, everyone. Welcome tonight. I'm so glad we had such a huge turnout here in Namaste Hall. Dr. Metzner, as you must know because you're here, is a recognized pioneer in psychological, philosophical, and cross-cultural studies of consciousness and its transformations. He collaborated with Tim Leary and Richard Alpert in classic studies of psychedelics in the 1960s at Harvard University. Dr. Metzner co-authored The Psychedelic Experience. He was also the editor of the Psychedelic Review. He is a psychotherapist and professor emeritus here at CIIS, where he was also academic dean for 10 years. His books include The Unfolding Self, The Well of Remembrance, Green Psychology, The Expansion of Consciousness, Alchemical Divination, and Mind, Space, and Time Stream. He is editor of 2 collections of essays on pharmacology, anthropology, and the phenomenology of ayahuasca and of psilocybin mushrooms. He is also the president and co-founder of the Green Earth Foundation, which is dedicated to healing and harmonizing the relations between humanity and the earth. And I call your attention to a wonderful table against the window where the Green Earth Foundation brochures and publications are there in offering to you. I'd like to give you one more moment with Ralph before he comes up. Ralph is a poet. He's an alchemist of the psyche. He's a friend, mentor, and colleague. And I'd like to share with you some of his eloquence to begin this evening. This is from Ralph. And this is related to a psychedelic experience, but one could also imagine Ralph is talking about altered states of consciousness of all kinds that bring us into what we're looking for. This experience facilitates the dissolving of barriers between body, mind, and spirit. One senses the aware presence of spirit infusing the structures of the body and the images and attitudes of the mind. Awareness expands to include all parts of the body, all aspects of mind, and the higher reaches of spirit, thus permitting a kind of reconnecting, a remembering of the totality of our experience and access to forgotten truths, thus permitting a kind of reconnecting and re-remembering of the totality of our experience and access to forgotten truths. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Ralph Metzner.
Thank you so much. Thank you to CIIS for inviting me, and thank you for Lisa for introducing me. Janice, for introducing me. So what I'd like to do is read from 3 passages from the 3 books that are of mine that were published this year, actually. So and then open it up to discussion with you. I'm going to try to time myself. I have a little time thing here, because my tendency is to go on and on and on once I get started. So I don't want to run out of time. So you'll forgive me for reading from this, but this will be a discipline for me. So I want to first read from this book, which is called Allies for Awakening, and its subtitle is Guidelines for Productive and Safe Experiences with Entheogens. So this is the book that tells about the nitty-gritty of drug experiences and things like dosages and things like that, the kinds of things that I never would be able to talk about before. But I'm no longer active in the field of psychedelic drug research. I'm retired. so I can write about it now. And plus, I want to say that my attitude, my posture in this book is that of an anthropologist more than a psychologist. I'm not here to prove anything. I'm not interested in proving that these substances or the experiences with them are effective for the treatment of any disease. That's why I don't say effective, I say productive. Because you're talking about expansion of consciousness. That means how are you going to evaluate effectiveness, you see? It's productive of what? Productive of new healing, new insight, new understanding, new awareness. That's the criterion. And there's no exact way to measure. And we're not trying to prove anything. So that's why I say, and safe, but safety is a big factor. So I do acknowledge, and it's very important, practices about dosages and so forth. And I'll say a little bit more about that. Oh, I think I need my glasses, actually. This thing didn't fall off my head. So here's the introduction. The drugs and plants in the general class of mind-altering or consciousness-expanding substances, which are known to have profound effects on the language centers of the brain, also have led to a curious set of terminological debates among researchers. No one seems to agree on what to call them. The classic triad of LSD, mescaline, and psilocybin were called psychotomimetic, which means psychosis mimicking, although they don't, except sometimes. Hallucinogenic, hallucination-inducing, although they don't, except sometimes. Psychodysleptic, what a disgusting term. Painful experience producing, although they don't, except sometimes. Psychedelic, mind manifesting, although they don't, except sometimes. And entheogenic, inner divinity connecting, although they don't, except sometimes. Expansion of consciousness, or magnification of perception, or awakening of awareness, are all phrases that are suggestive of the non-specific content of our experiences with these substances. That's why you can never answer the question when people say, well, what do these drugs do? You can't answer that question. Not like any other drug, you see. You ask about tranquilizer, say, well, it makes you tranquil. And ask about a stimulant, it makes you more energetic. With these drugs, you can't say. You can only say, well, it depends. Depends what you are doing with them. So the best analogy is, and Tim Leary used to point to the analogy of psychedelics with the microscope and the telescope as scientific tools for the amplification and magnification of perception. What we see through the microscope is a function of what we put on the slide to look at. What we see through the telescope is a function of the part of the sky toward which it is oriented. The perceptual instruments allow us to observe phenomena at a scale or reality to which we don't have access in our ordinary functional waking state. Similarly, intentional entheogenic experiences allow us to perceive our psychic contents with a degree of amplification and understanding ordinarily difficult to attain. Entheogenesis means the awakening realization that we human beings and the world around us are much more than simply material organisms living and evolving on a material planetary body. We are multi-dimensional, spiritual, cosmic, noetic, psychic, and earthly beings. The Sufi mystics offered the analogy that we humans are the occupants of a multi-storied mansion, but have focused our attention and awareness for so long on the ground floor that we have forgotten even the existence of the higher levels, much less the methods of accessing them. In the Eastern religious worldviews, such as those associated with Hinduism and Buddhism, the existence and reality of higher spiritual dimensions of our being is accepted as a matter of course, and many different yogic methods of meditation developed to access them. The central consciousness expanding insight that emerges from psychedelic entheogenic states and is confirmed by the perennial spiritual traditions of East and West is that at every level, from macrocosmic to the microcosmic, from atoms and animals to trees and planets and stars, spirit dwells within created form and expresses through them. So now I want to say a couple of things about dosages. I have a chapter in here about spirit medicine practices, and I have chapters on some of the common traditional kinds of sessions. For example, I just read from the table of growth-oriented psychotherapeutic individual sessions in a medical clinic, or growth-oriented sessions in a non-medical group contrast. Then traditional peyote ceremonies of the Native American Church, another group called the Peyote Way Church of God, traditional mushroom ceremonies in the Mazatec Indians, Amazonian mestizo ayahuasca ceremonies, Brazilian religious ceremonies with ayahuasca, and then what I call hybrid entheogenic group ceremonies that have arisen in the last 20, 30 years, both in Europe and the United States and other countries, and which are the kinds of sessions that the average person nowadays is most likely to come into contact with, and the different elements of that which have been developed. So, and one of the things, one of the key points I want to make about this book, because I was involved in an earlier book that Leary Albert and I published in the 1960s called The Psychedelic Experience, where we talked about LSD, mescaline, and psilocybin. I wrote the chapter on dosages. And I actually made a mistake in that chapter, which I now have, with this new book, have the opportunity to correct. Because what I didn't understand is that the dose-response curve for these substances, as for many substances, is a U-shaped curve, or inverted U-shaped curve. In other words, the effective dose that you want to use is somewhere between too little and too much. It's not a linear curve, but taking a higher dose does not necessarily lead to a more productive experience. In fact, it can be quite the opposite. And it's a U-shaped curve, and so it's important to understand the range. So, so what I say is I will be estimating in the following chapters about each of the substances two important dosage figures based on the figures provided by the authors who published the papers and my own observations in the underground psychedelic drug culture. My posture, as I mentioned, is that of an anthropologist, a participant observer model, not experimental placebo-controlled studies. That's another model, but that's not the model that's most widely used by most people who use psychedelics. They are, of course, double-blind placebo-controlled studies, but they represent a very small proportion of the total number of entheogenic research that's going on. Very small. Which is by nature of the political situation that we're in, an underground culture, for very obvious reasons, because the actual possession of the actual substances is illegal. So people have this weird thing about not wanting to go to jail for what they're practicing. So I will be estimating these two important dosage figures and the observations in the underground psychedelic cultures that I estimate. One is called the ED50. That's actually a term used in pharmacology. It's called the effective dose of 50%. 50% of the subjects, whether it's be animals or people or whatever, show a certain response. It's a threshold dose. So ED50 would be the threshold dosage at which psychoactive effects are observed by about half the subjects or in half the trials. And then, now in animal pharmacology, they have an LD50, which is the dose at which 50% of the rats die. Obviously, that's not relevant to these studies. because these drugs don't kill people. What they do produce at higher dosages is a dissociation. Dissociation is a very strange and misunderstood process, an experience. It's where you don't have an experience that you can relate. You don't think you've had an experience. You don't realize you've had an experience. So you're not missing something. It's not like you've had an experience and you forgot it. You never recorded it. So that's why dissociation is very subtle. So all you can do is, what I do is I provide the estimate. The dosage, the DD50, so I call it DD50, the dosage at which about half the subjects or half the experiences involve some degree of dissociation and or dysphoria, but not necessarily dysphoria. People can have dissociative experiences that are not unpleasant. It's not like a bad trip. It's no trip. And you can see this in the books by Shulgin, who some of you know. He was a brilliant chemist, and he always gives the dosages as is appropriate in science as a range between enough and too much, you see. And so all the experience, you don't want to take too little and you don't want to take too much. So there's a very famous saying by Paracelsus, the great 14th century philosopher, cosmologist, and physician, who anticipated so much in our modern world. And his approach to medicine was multidimensional. He took into account planetary, astrological factors, spiritual factors, religious, philosophical, familial, social, everything, right down to the body, the pharmacology, the chemistry, and everything else. So he says, the difference between the medicine and the poison is the dosage. The very same medicine at one dosage can be curing, and at another dosage can be poison. And in addition to that, as if that wasn't complicated enough, and this is a factor that I didn't understand in the 60s, and I think a lot of the people, the psychedelic kind of hippie researchers in the 60s also did not understand. In fact, I know they didn't, but I know I didn't. And in the psychedelic experience, we didn't understand it. And so in this book, what I give is, I have a passage where I talk about individual factors affecting the intensity of an experience that need to be taken into account. One, of course, is body weight, and that's common knowledge. In all medicine, you take into account the body weight. The effective dose is higher for somebody of heavier body weight. So the effective and dissociative dosages for a lighter person will be lower than for the heavier person. Innate sensitivity is a factor that's not often recognized, if ever. There are inherent or innate differences in nervous system perceptual sensitivity that are not as easily recognized or measurable by any presently known medical or psychological instrumentation. At the high end of the sensitivity spectrum, there are individuals, sometimes called clairvoyant or clairsentient, who respond more strongly and vividly than average to any perceptual stimulus, whether internal or external. Many artists and so-called psychics or intuitives fall into this category. The intensity of their perceptual and affective response to any given stimulus, internal or external, is stronger than average. Therefore, the effective and dissociative dosage for them would tend to be lower than average. And this unrecognized factor, so the factor of these individual innate differences in response sensitivity is not efficiently appreciated in the underground drug subculture, according to my observation. A given dose of a drug can produce effects differing significantly in intensity in different individuals, even when the other factors of set and setting are held constant. I've come to believe that such unrecognized individual differences in response sensitivity represent an additional factor that can lead to unpleasant and non-useful dissociative experiences in those who are focused solely on the specifics of the drugs involved. And in addition, another factor is experiential learning. So in the groups that I've observed, people seem to learn through experience what their inherent sensitivity is and adjust their intake accordingly. Experienced inner space explorers and those who devote careful attention to the set and setting of their explorations will be far less likely to have dissociative elements in their experience than inexperienced and ill-prepared trippers. The range between the ED50 and the DD50 can be considered the level at which the average intelligent, well-informed seeker-observer can expect to have psychologically useful and philosophically meaningful experiences. And that's why I wrote this book, I give for all the drugs that I'm aware of, my estimate. Well, it's all going to be estimates, of course. It's not an area of exact measurement of this range between the ED50 and the DD50. So then I want to read this passage here. So I just from the I talked about the different drugs, and giving that fact, I have a whole section on precautions and safety. I have a whole section on closing ceremonies and integration. I have the general kind of practical suggestion that people devote equal amounts of time to preparing one of these psychedelic or entheogenic sessions or ceremonies as the session lasts itself, and equal amount of time integrating them afterwards. If you don't do that, in a way, you're wasting the experience, you see. Or you're not getting nearly as much out of it than you can. So, in practice, that tends to work out. If you think of the average tripper session with MDMA or something like that, lasting about 3 or 4 hours, then you should spend at least 3 or 4 hours preparing for it, becoming clear about what your intentions are and your questions. Of course, if you're doing a research project, that's all given. And then at least the experience afterwards and integrating it afterwards. So in a typical weekend experience that a group of friends might have, that works out that way. That people spend a little while preparing. Sometimes not enough time preparing. Perhaps they could spend more time, and a little time afterwards integration. I'm not saying that we always did it that way. Of course, in our research, we're always learning. People are always learning, and you learn from experience. That's why I wrote the book. So this, so I just want to read this last part here. Individuals in contemporary Western urban cultures vary enormously in the frequency with which they ingest entheogens. I have known individuals who chose to participate only once in a ceremony, perhaps to break through a block in creativity, or to work through the breakup of a relationship, or to signal a major life transition in work, and then felt no further need or interest in further sessions. My old friend and colleague Ramdas has said he chooses perhaps once a year to participate in an entheogenic session just to tune in with his higher self, to see if he's still in touch. Those who choose to conduct healing ceremonies for others, or are in the process of learning how to do so, will have to consider their own individual life trajectories and family safety needs, determined by a complex mix of institutional and professional conditions, as well as the larger evolving socio-political context of the individual's actually existing nation-state. Those healers, explorers, artists, and scientists interested in using these means in their practice with others, and those who have chosen to become spokespersons and advocates for the integration of these tools into contemporary society, like myself and others, will need to confront the pervasive and ignorant prohibitionist mindset and police state context of drugs. A few years ago, I was at one of the large international conferences of researchers and students in this field, held in Basel, Switzerland, traditional center of medieval alchemy. In the program mix of respected scientists, doctors, artists, philosophers, and journalists, most of whom, perhaps all, had experienced and were discussing the multiple properties and virtues of these new and yet ancient substances. There was an electrifying presentation by audio tape from an individual who could, regrettably, not be present. It was a talk and an appeal by a young American with no prior criminal background whatsoever, who had been arrested in England for possession of a quantity of LSD and hashish, no other drugs of any kind. No evidence was presented during his trial that any harm had been caused by his activity to anyone. He stated in his defense that his motive for making and distributing The sacrament was to contribute to societal improvement. For this, he was serving a 20-year sentence and had already lost one appeal. The audio tape statement was listened to by an audience of a couple of thousand people in respectful silence, focusing the following question in each listener. What does it mean that the maker and distributor of a substance which had been a sanity-saving remedy and/or an aid to enlightened understanding for many hundreds or perhaps thousands was now serving time in jail? What kind of a society are we that this is possible? So, I always like to consider the larger context, as you probably have noticed. Perfect. I think we're doing great on the timing thing here. This is working out. Nothing like planning. Now I want to read you a couple of poems. This is my first book of poems. It's called Diving for Treasures, and Poems and Epilogues. Some of the poems none of them were previously published in written form, but they were previously recorded. And there's a CD recording where I'm reading the poem, and Kit Walker, who's a fantastic multi-instrumentalist musician, is weaving music around them. This CD is actually available. It's called Spirit Soundings. So I want to read you two poems from that. One of them is called Ayahuasca Serpent Vision. And those of you that have taken ayahuasca will recognize this vision. I pray to the serpent vine of visions. Help me heal the ancient wounds. Slowly the glittering snakes glide and slide, insinuating intimately into my deepest roots. I'm inside the serpent mother now, coiling, writhing, turning, squirming, our bodies merged, one skin, one spine. The space within expands to spaciousness, our little band of travelers on the spirit boat, in the house, on the river, in the snake, sailing serenely along the darkening stream. The great serpent's body expands once more, encompassing now the river of time, the bark of human civilization. Whole villages and towns I see, temples and palaces, pyramids and towers, kingdoms and nations, Egypt, Rome, India, America, carried by the currents of collective fate through the millennia, one great stream, one great snake. Now, continents and oceans, cloud mountains I see, vast deserts, rain forests, river deltas, shimmering body of diamond rainbow serpent, mother of all organic life on earth. And now, the earth with her companion worlds, moon, Venus, Mercury, Mars, spinning and whirling stately serpentine orbits around primordial mother, father, son. The bark of hundreds of millions of years sails on, great cosmic stars, sun, serpent, wheeling majestically around the Milky Way, galactic center, dark source of all radiance. Get you right into it, can't it? You remember it. This other one is called Omens for Our Planetary Future. For 100 years now, wise teachers and elders have urged, we must bring together the spirituality of the East with the energy and material master of the West. Here we are. California Institute of Asian Studies. The Tibetan oracle said, when the iron horse flies, the Dharma will come to the land of the red man. This prophecy has come to pass. And behold, a new vision arises for a new century. The people of the northern nations will relate with respect and justice, not violence and greed, to the uncounted millions of the southern countries and the land, the forests and the riches of the earth. The prophet-seers of the Incas say, the condor of the south and the eagle of the north will fly together in freedom. The visionary serpent vine says, the bear and the wolf of the north, the jaguar and the lion of the south will track together and hunt together for vibrant life and healing knowledge. The great serpent of the Amazon forest, the wise turtle of the California desert, will share their ancient secrets again with humans humble enough to want to learn, to live in balance with one another and with the earth, embracing and nourishing her children, great goddess, mother of all the living. All right. Thank you. I deliberately put the poems in the middle rather than at the end. If I put them at the end, everybody wants to stay in that kind of meditative state. So we're going to get into discussion. So I'm going to read a couple of passages from this book, The Expansion of Consciousness. This was originally, or still is, originally volume 1 of a series of books that I've written, which are now being republished in one as one volume, eventually. And in this first book, there are 2 parts, and I'll read you the. One of them was one chapter. The first part is called "The Quest for the Alchemical Philosopher's Stone," and it was written originally as a homage to Albert Hoffman, the discoverer of LSD and psilocybin, and one of the great masters of our scientists, masters of our time. Who was an alchemist in the tradition, the genuine tradition of the alchemist. Although he didn't know that tradition, you see. He was trained in the material science of our contemporary 20th century. He was worked for a pharma industry. He worked for Sandoz, pharmaceutical company, producing new drugs. But he was, discovered the LSD, for which he should have gotten a Nobel Prize. The second part is I call the transformations of collective consciousness. Because there's individual consciousness, and you can talk about expansion and contraction, and then there's collective consciousness, what some people call mass mind, the consciousness of a whole tribe, a family, a nation, a culture, a society, a whole world. Collective human consciousness, we call a world view. So I call transformations of collective consciousness an octave of world history. And the octave principle is a developmental principle, it goes through 7 stages. It's an ancient esoteric principle, very, very ancient, that was espoused particularly by those in the philosophers in the tradition of Gurdjieff and Ouspensky, whom some of you may know. And so I describe an octave of world history from 1945 to 2001. So I'm going to read you first a brief passage from this first chapter, The Quest for the Alchemical Philosopher's Stone, which talks about the parallels between alchemy and shamanism. In tracing the historical roots of alchemy to shamanic knowledge-seeking traditions, a question arises: is what happened to the understanding and practice of all the states of consciousness, the shamanic journey? Those of you who have studied the shamanic journey practices, where the drum is used to produce a journey in consciousness, with Michael Harner or Sandra Inkerman or one of the other many people teaching this kind of work, and some of you may be involved in it yourself. The shamanic journey to acquire healing knowledge and power, which is a central technical process, technical process of alchemy, of shamanism. We must remember that shamanic practices arose in hunter-gatherer societies, particularly among hunters in intimate contact with animals, both those hunted for food and those that are hunters or raptors themselves as allies. Thus, the metaphor of the journey, riding on an animal or transformed into one, is a natural choice to describe the process of seeking knowledge for healing and guidance, known as divination, by going into an intentional, lucid trance state. Such shamanic journey states are typically induced by rhythmic drumming, as in Siberian and other Northern Hemisphere indigenous societies, or by the ingestion of psychoactive plant extracts, often accompanied by rhythmic chanting, as in the ceremonies involving peyote or the psilocybin mushrooms or ayahuasca. The use of the plant extracts for shamanic journey has been more common in tropical and subtropical latitudes because of the greater diversity of plant life in those regions. The first alchemists, by contrast, were craftsmen. They called themselves artists in the fields of mining and blacksmithing, living in villages or towns. So this is Neolithic rather than Paleolithic cultures. So they were also health practitioners using medicinal minerals, herbs, and fungi. So their preferred term for the work of self-transformation was the opus, the work, or the art. See that I'm making the contrast there. The shamanic tradition describe the work that they do as going on a journey for healing or knowledge. The alchemists described what they were doing for the work, but it was also for healing and knowledge. So their interest was in long-lasting transformation of the totality of the human beings. So this is just to give you an idea. I think it's a very useful and brings a lot of insight to compare shamanic practices with alchemical practices and with yogic practices. All three, the alchemy, shamanism, and yoga, with shamanism being the oldest, alchemy more developed in the West, and yoga much further developed in the East. All they're multi-dimensional processes involving transformation at the physical, emotional, mental, and spiritual levels, integrated at all levels, not separate. You see, in the West, our worldview is completely screwed up because we have this separation. We think of the spiritual realms as something different. It belongs to religion. And science and religion are not supposed to have anything to do with it. But that's a historical accident. That's not inherent in the nature of the world. And leads to bad results and wrong results if you think it's inherent in the nature of the world. So then this is from the second chapter, the transformations of collective consciousness, an octave of world history from 1945 to 2001. The first consciousness expanding experience, whether triggered by a psychedelic substance or some other catalyst, often represents a significant transformative turning point in an individual's life. Similarly, the introduction of psychedelics into Western culture in the mid-20th century, synchronistically with the end of World War II, Hoffman discovered the effect of LSD in 1945, 3 months before the explosion of the first atomic bomb. How's that for a synchronicity? Synchronicity with the end of World War II and the explosion of the first atomic bomb catalyzed a series of profound socio-cultural transformations, movements in all areas of society. Were these transformations of expansions of consciousness a response of the collective psyche of humanity to the unprecedented threat to civilization posed by nuclear weaponry? That's the question that I'm asking, suggesting. Then, so I talk about this octave, and the octave, octave has 7 steps, or 8. Each step is 7 years. And I'll just read you. And it's very important to recognize that, and this is a significant change in the first edition of this book. I just said the octave is a series of progressive steps. What I realized now, I went back to the writings of Gurdjieff and Uspensky, who really delved, especially Gurdjieff, deeply into the meaning of an octave. An octave is not necessarily a progression, because an octave development can be deviated from its original point to the point where it can even go in the opposite direction, which is now what I think had happened to this octave of collective transformation. I am taking the year 1945 as my starting point of a historical active, the climactic end of World War II with its 70 million dead, and the explosions of the first atomic bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki will in future be seen, I believe, as the beginning of a new epoch of the human presence on Earth. Mankind had reached an unprecedented level of technological sophistication in their weaponry, but without concurrent moral and political maturity. This, how am I doing on time? Okay, so, this quantum leap of destructive technology seems to have triggered attention from higher dimensions of our world. Scientists that have studied UFO sightings and reported contact with ET technology mark the year 1947, when a saucer crashed in the New Mexico desert, as the beginning of the modern era of alien contact and government military cover-up of such contacts. Some authors have even suggested that the explosions of the atomic bomb triggered intensified contact and study by alien visitors because such weaponry represented a major disruption of the time-space matrix of our entire solar system. While there are different ways of analyzing the octave series of changes in any system, I have further chosen the year 2001 with the 9/11 Trade Tower attacks as the end date for this historical octave series, both because of the profoundly disruptive nature of the event and because the perpetrators of the attacks, contrary to mainstream opinion, have not as yet been actually identified or apprehended. There are significant indications that a secret group or cabal of agents has taken control of the key centers of power in the Western world. In a striking synchronicity, as this revised chapter goes to press, a new book by French researcher Laurent Guyeno has appeared that uses the concept of deep state and deep politics to analyze the periods from the 1963 murder of JFK to the 9/11 Trade Towers collapse along similar lines. Obviously, I don't have time to go into the details of all of this, but I will read just a couple more passages. Unresolved questions continue to swirl in the public mind about the 1961 John F. Kennedy assassination, as well as the assassinations of Robert Kennedy and Martin Luther King, both in 1968. Opinion polls over the years have continued to show that more than 50% of the American people do not believe the official story of the John F. Kennedy assassination, including the alleged single assassin story. 50%. Similar figures apply to, and as you may or may not know, there's a vast body of literature, published literature, scientific literature on, I think, not only the John F. Kennedy, but the Robert Kennedy, Martin Luther King assassination, and Malcolm X assassination. So in one of my books I have looking at Robert Kennedy and John F. Kennedy, two white leaders of the people, and Malcolm X and Martin Luther King, two black leaders of the people, all being assassinated in that 1960s, early 70s period. Interesting, isn't it? All of them unsolved murders. The actual perpetrators have not been publicly identified. There's a cover story for each one of them. The issues of unsolved murders of popular leaders going back 40 years to the 1960s remains a festering open wound in the collective psyche of the American people. How could it be otherwise? Powerful and popular leaders in a society are killed, and a significant proportion of the population believe and think the perpetrators of these crimes involving unknown people in high positions have not been brought to justice. The issues around the 2001 Trade Towers attacks are even more sensitive in the public mind and media, no discussion of alternatives to the official versions of the events of 9/11 is permitted in mainstream media. We just saw it. We just had the celebrations. On all the media discussions, there was never a hint of the fact that there is another story. Although there is a voluminous literature with dozens of books and statistical and scientific investigations. Just recently, in 2013, a group of architects, engineers, and experts in building technology have begun a major public relations campaign to reopen the whole story of the Trade Tower attacks for a new examination. Hasn't happened yet, but hey. So the attacks of 9/11 in 2001 obviously delivered a violent external shock to the American and indeed the global economic and political order, as well as the collective psyche of Western civilization. In my view, this shock is likely to have even more devastating repercussions when it is revealed and widely understood that the attacks not only were used to instill a climate of fear in the American people and justify unlimited aggressive military interventions across the globe, but that they were planned and orchestrated by secret shadow cabals within the US government for the furtherance of their own hegemonic ambitions and control of dwindling global energy resources. So, after the 1960s, the line of, so what I say is looking at this octave, the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, 1945, 7 years, the 50s, the 60s is would be the step between mi and fa, and the octave, that's a significant step between the third and the fourth note, where the octave has to get another push in order to continue moving upward. If it doesn't, it starts to go degenerative direction. And that's what happened now, I believe. That's the difference between the earliest, first edition of this book and now the second edition. I no longer believe it was a continuous expansion of consciousness. It was a expansion of consciousness up into the 60s, and then the whole movement crashed and went. After the 1960s, the line of societal movements meandered along with some expansions and contractions of consciousness, but mostly downward in relationship to personal liberty and progressive peace values. And a second shock between C and the new dough would be required to maintain an upward movement. Instead, we had the Trade Towers attack in 2001, plunging the progressive and liberating movements into a death spiral from which they have not recovered. Different and darker forces are at work now, exemplified most strongly by the fact that the official story of the 9/11 attacks, accepted and promulgated by the mainstream media, has been demonstrated to be not only false, but physically impossible, and yet taboo for public discussion. Think about that. What does that mean, you see? What does that mean for who we are? So that is the question with which I would like to leave you. Something to think about. So thank you very much for your attention.
Hi, Ralph. I wanted to say, isn't the movement to legalize marijuana an expansion of consciousness that's going on right now?
The question is for you, Ralph, isn't the present movement toward the legalization of marijuana evidence of the octave continuing in a positive direction?
Well, the octave thing is just a model, and there's lots of different octaves at work. The situation is extremely complex. So the legalization of a partial legalization of a substance, cannabis is an amazing substance, ancient healing plant. Not only healing, but with many other virtues of consciousness and expansion, and appetite stimulation, medical application. Very, very ancient, very, very potentially beneficial plant. That's been illegal for 50 years. Why? It's potentially also a fantastically money-producing crop. And, all kinds of applications in clothing and manufacture, quite apart from its mind-expanding properties. And yet, why is it still illegal to treat it as a drug with all these dangerous consequences, which have been demonstrated to be false many times over? See? So, that's an interesting sociological, historical question. Obviously, there are interests at work that want to keep it that way. And it probably, I can just guess, and your guess is as good as mine, it has to do with money. There's enormous amounts of money to be made, both illegally in the production of this crop by all kinds of international groups, it's not legal groups, and by the military-industrial police enforcement complex in the enforcement of the prohibition, just like same as with alcohol prohibition, which is small potatoes compared to marijuana. So, and in amongst that, all of that, potential positive, therapeutic, beneficial, physically, emotional, psychologically, beneficial healing plants, not to mention even the recreational. I mean, after all, what's wrong with recreation? And as a recreational drug, way, way more safe, more valuable, more interesting, and safer than the most popular recreational drug, alcohol, which is except in moderate doses. So.
Here's a question, or rather, would you care to comment about this phenomenon that has been termed the globalization of ayahuasca, which is currently taking place?
The globalization of ayahuasca?
Yes.
Well, ayahuasca is a South American spirit medicine, and spirit medicine means that it's a medicine that, as in all indigenous cultures, medicine is not separated from spirituality, from spiritual growth, psychological problem solving, familial and social problem solving, and physical healing are all integrated together. It has an ancient traditional culture behind it, historical development behind it. And it has also this strange 20th century development that there are no less than 3 Brazilian churches organized around its use in a religious ceremonial use. And the introduction of this ancient shamanic ceremonial sacrament into modern culture is an interesting phenomenon. I think from a psychological, pharmacological point of view, psychological growth point of view, I don't think ayahuasca is necessarily more interesting or more effective than, say, mushrooms or psychedelic or LSD or peyote or any of these other substances. But it has a certain cachet because it comes from a culture, and it's sort of legal, maybe, sort of, sometimes. And that's a big attraction. Naturally, because people have this strange thing. They don't want to go to jail for their religious practices or their healing practices. Strange, isn't it? Whereas, if you're taking mushrooms, then you already know you're doing something illegal. No matter where you do it. So, but it's an interesting thing, and it's hard for people. I think what I've seen in my forays into some of these cultures is, you can go to Pucallpa in Peru, and you can walk down the street and you can buy a bottle of ayahuasca at a stall. Just like you buy a bottle of whiskey at a stall. Ayahuasca, here it is, 50 pesos or whatever. No, nothing. You don't have to do any ceremony, any introduction, any spiritual practice, nothing. You just buy it and chug around. So what is that, you see? So, okay, so people are trying to make money, and they're indigenous people. We don't begrudge the indigenous people to make money by selling something that they have, a unique product, of course. That doesn't answer your question, but, the question raises so many other interesting perspectives. Yeah.
No, I mean, there are ceremonies now happening in Latvia, in Finland, in Berlin, in Chicago, in Los Angeles, in
all
Tokyo.
over the place. All over the place.
What's that about?
Yeah. Yes, what is it about?
See, ayahuasca shamans all over the globe.
Well, it has this cachet, see? There's that's something I've noticed because I travel a lot in Germany. I've been to many of these countries. I've been to Latvia, but I've been to Estonia and England and many times. And ayahuasca has acquired this reputation. And part of it is because it's accessible. I've published 2 books of collections of psychic experiences with and scientific articles about mushrooms and psychoactive mushrooms and ayahuasca. The one on ayahuasca sells about 10 times as many copies. Now, I wondered, why is that? I mean, ayahuasca is not necessarily 10 times as interesting. And in fact, it has one big drawback compared to mushrooms, which it makes you throw up. It has this there's this kind of strange mystique about throwing up with ayahuasca, as if that was somehow, but that is a part of its healing virtue, because what you throw up is not, throwing up with ayahuasca is not a sign that you're sick. It means that you're a sign that you're getting rid of sickness that you already were carrying, you see. It's a completely different experience. You don't feel bad after throwing up, you feel fantastic. People say, oh, I just threw up, it's fantastic, better than I've ever felt in my whole life. That's not just an ordinary throwing up, you see. And so that, it's really convincing. It's really convincing. And so I remember in one... and I always used to say to people, if you're in an ayahuasca session, pay attention to what you were thinking about just before you threw up. Because it was probably you were getting rid of something toxic. And what you were getting rid of may not be personal. That's the other thing. Because none of us is alone. We're all connected to family, of course we know that, connected to society. I'll give you an example. A guy I know in a group that I participated in, they were taking ayahuasca, and I was taking ayahuasca, and for some reason I was thinking about the war in El Salvador. I started thinking about the war in El Salvador, which was going on, the civil war, right? People were being massacred and decapitated and all this brutal stuff that was going on. And the minute I started thinking about ayahuasca, I went, blah. Now, I don't have any connection to El Salvador. I don't have any Salvador relatives. But I'm a human being. So I was connected to those people. And just this thought, reminded me, tapped me into that part of the mass mind. And that part of it is toxic. So I was part of the drainage system for that mass mind current. That's what happens. So when you throw up and detoxify stuff, it may not even be personal. Sometimes it will be personal. You might throw up, the child abuse that you had when you were a child, or some other thing, but it may be just part of the culture. It could be, for example, a lot of that times when I was seeing the people that throw up the most are people that are regular smokers. So what they're throwing up is all the accumulated toxins in their lungs from tobacco smoking over decades and years. Does that make sense?
Ralph, a question in the back here.
Yeah.
In the beginning, you said something about effective and productive as 2 different ways of knowing.
Right.
And I'm wondering if you could say something, what you feel about the training of therapists, given that distinction.
About the training of therapists?
Of therapists to do the medicine work, yes.
Well, yeah. Well, that's the thing, So, therapist training is part of the medical system. Therapists are part of the medical system. That's not true in shamanic cultures. It's not true in indigenous cultures at all. It's all integrated. So certainly in the shaman just tunes into what the spirits are that are in you. And so, the effective dose is an obsession of the medical pharmaceutical complex. The medical pharmaceutical complex is a criminal organization that is oriented towards making profit, nothing else, from drugs. Nothing else. And the only way they can make profit from selling drugs is by selling a drug that somebody else is not selling, or hasn't sold before, that's somehow better, more effective at what? Curing some symptom. That's why you see an increasing list of symptoms appear every year in the DSM-4, the Diagnostic Statistical Manual. More and more symptoms that can be diagnosed. Once they have an official diagnosis, that means the medical, pharmaceutical, insurance complex, which are all connected, will make the payments, and you get the doctors will get reimbursed. So, but that doesn't apply to consciousness expansion, you see. How can you talk about consciousness expansion? Being effective in consciousness, what's the criterion? To have a criterion means it's not expanding. That's why I changed the subtitle from effective to productive. Productive of new understanding, new insights. And that's why Shogun, who was a genius chemist, who made this enormous contribution by publishing his studies of new drugs and always holding the set and the setting constant, because it was the same group of subjects, about a dozen people that he'd known for years who knew each other in the same kind of setting. So he was holding the set and the setting constant, just changing the dosages of the new drugs that he was testing out. So he could say, well, the differences in experience are due to this particular drug and this particular dosage. But he himself says he considers the whole criterion on the whole focus on effectiveness totally misguided, because you're expanding a consciousness. You don't know it's going to. That's why I say productive of new understandings, new insights, and the researchers always. I feel for the researchers. I support their research. I donate money to them because it's the only kind of research that's allowed to be done officially. Do the double-blind placebo-controlled studies. But I think they're unethical to do, actually. Because the researcher is not supposed to take the drug, you see. He's not supposed to know what the effect of the drug is, so that his knowledge doesn't... So they have these double-blind, quadruple-blind, and nobody knows, and the researchers don't know, and the people don't know, and the statisticians don't know who's taking what. But those studies were already done in the 60s. You said, well, we have better control groups now, But they're just repeating the studies. It was already in the 60s when the studies that Walter Pankey did, the so-called Good Friday studies, double-blind, placebo-controlled, and half the people had psilocybin and half the people had a control group. And the setting was constant in a chapel doing a Good Friday service led by Howard Thurman, a black preacher. And the sessions were held in the underground thing, and they were experienced people. I was one of the assistants. And within half an hour, everybody knew who had the placebo and who had the drug. Within half an hour. So the rest of the experiment was a complete charade. And that's the same one now. It's exactly the same now. And it's a misguided attempt because you're not trying to prove anything, you see. You're trying to test something. You're trying to test some new possibilities. You're not trying to prove anything because you're not trying to sell anything. So forgive me for raving on about that. So, I think this double-blind placebo-controlled model has to be given a decent burial. And just forget it. And there is another model, actually. There is another model, and it's called the translational model. The translational model of social science research, you're not trying to prove anything. You're trying to find out what's the most valuable application of a particular methodology. At every level, the level of the individual, the family, the culture, the society, the different classes, the different professional groups that are interested in it, like that. Translational model, look for that. That's the model. Forget the double-blind placebo-controlled model. It's a pharmaceutical thing. So,
could you please name some of the main, your main criticism of how these plants and substances are being studied and researched in a scientific setting? Because you have a longer outline, so you're aware of a lot of studies that are being done. So what's the main criticism that you have for how these studies are conducted? What's the methodology and all that?
Would you like him to go beyond what he's just said about the problems with the double-blind random studies?
Yeah,
is there something you're looking to hear?
I want to elaborate.
Yes. I think I see what you mean. I want to say this. What I think are the two most useful avenues of research that I think would be really valuable and good and productive to pursue research and application, the translational application model. One is in the treatment of trauma with MDMA. I think MDMA is a unique substance among other psychedelic substances. There are MDMA and a couple of, 2 or 3 other substances in that same class, what I call them empathogenic, because they're different from all the other hallucinogenic drugs like mushroom, LSD, mescaline, all the other DMT, all of them, because they don't produce any visions. You just see what is, and you have equanimity behind it. I call them empathogenic. They seem to generate a natural state of empathy, whatever they're looking at. They are by far the best treatment modality for the treatment of trauma that's ever been discovered. Far better than LSD, far better than psilocybin, or any other substance, because they allow the person just to look at what's happening, and not react with the stress. The stress reaction seems to be like just down. They're also fantastically useful in interpersonal relationships and communication. But the chances of them being approved for that are almost nil. The chances for them of being approved in the treatment of trauma, I think, are very big, because the treatment trauma is a huge subject, and PTSD is a huge need, and the treatment of PTSD is huge. And not only from accidents, just think about war trauma, and they're like dozens. What's the number? There's something like 100 war veterans commit suicide every month. Every month now, and they're carrying trauma from Iraq and Vietnam, and I worked with one traumatized Vietnam veteran, and the veterans, they're all conditioned to be macho men. They don't like to admit trauma. Well, they may have their legs shot off or their arms shot off, then you can have a trauma. But if they're just scared shitless, you're not allowed to admit that, even though it could be completely debilitating. So, on the other hand, I think the treatment of PTSD with MDMA is a huge potential. On the other hand, frankly, Rick Doblin is a friend of mine, and I support his efforts. I have my doubts whether it's going to happen. Look at the difficulties we're having getting alcohol decriminalized. Getting marijuana decriminalized. And plus, you see, so then you go through all the double-blind placebo control. You do 5 years of studies and all these experimental groups, and apply the safety, prove the safety over and over again. It's been proven many times over again. It's one of the safest drugs. There are hundreds, maybe millions of people who use MDMA recreationally all the time. Where are the corpses if it's so dangerous? Where are they? Where are the flipped-out people? We're caught in this rigmarole, social political ritual. But I think other countries are not so caught in it. So I think you're going to see MDMA-supported treatment centers in other countries like Switzerland, maybe South America, maybe Brazil, I don't know. Maybe the Americans will get around to it eventually. And I actually think that one really good possibility is to set it up south of the border. There's a whole tradition. People can go south of the border, and you can get ibogaine treatment for addiction. Now, ibogaine is another one of these drugs that'll never be accepted. But first of all, it's way off, so it's not a new drug, so it can't be commercialized. Nobody's interested. Plus, it's used in the treatment of addicts, and it's quite toxic. So addicts have this disconcerting habit of dying with it. Because it's quite toxic, you see. You have to be very, very careful to set it up. So there's like about a dozen ibogaine addiction treatment centers outside the United States, in Mexico, in Canada, in Guatemala, some other countries. And I think a model like that would work much better for MDMA treatment for trauma. I think why not? See, so that's That's one thing. And now the other thing, I think, the other application that is most interesting would be the treatment of the use of LSD or psilocybin in the end-of-life studies. Now, end-of-life, you know, there are a lot of people that have PTSD, but end-of-life, everybody has it. That's 100% of the population has end-of-life anxiety. Guaranteed. So the need is huge, because there's no understanding what end-of-life actually means. Unlike most other cultures in the world, and historically, cross-culturally and historically. Understand completely that life after death, of course, is taken for granted. It's an obvious fact. Not even a question. You don't have to prove anything. The real question is, are you prepared? And how are you prepared? And what are your expectations? And that has profound ethical and social implications, as everybody can easily recognize, you see. And somehow, see, that understanding got X'd out. And that was early on. So the idea of reincarnation got X'd out of mainstream Western religious culture in the 4th century. And they said, no, the Catholic Church said, we want to focus everything on this life. And you're going to be good in this life. Well, otherwise you're only these 3 options: heaven, hell, and purgatory. And the most common ones are not that attractive. And, so you better shape up and do the right thing. From the point of view of religious history, that's an absurd oversimplification. And it's not true. Those are not the 3 options. The reality is that the afterlife worlds are at least as complex and infinitely varied as this life. How could it be otherwise? You think about it for a second how could it be otherwise? You come back to the multidimensional world in which we've always lived, in which we shut off once we get born, for a purpose. So, I think end-of-life studies where people are given, and Aldous Huxley, pioneered the whole thing. Not necessarily even taking LSD at the moment of dying, which is what he did, but taking it in preparation for dying and setting up centers. Just like now we have, what's it called? What are the studies called where somebody comes into your home when you're dying? Hospice. Right, you could envision an expansion of the hospice model. Where people could be offered a low-dose LSD or psilocybin experience. Optionally, of course, always, optionally. And you're not trying to prove anything, you're not trying to test anything. And there are some studies, I want to mention them because I'm protective of them, where people in a sort of applied model, trying to introduce a good practice, a healthy practice, a socially productive practice into the society. That help people prepare themselves in their own way. And it doesn't have to be religious, it doesn't have to be Jewish, Christian, Buddhist, or anything else. Whatever your life, whatever your religion is, you see. And all the religions have different views, of course. Again, you're not trying to prove anything, you're just trying to make it a transition because it is the great transition into the unknown. There are 2 great transitions into the unknown that go from where you go from something that you know that's narrow into an expanded world that's bigger but unknown, except you know it's bigger. There was a cartoon that was published in the newsletter of the Association for Pre- and Perinatal Psychology and Health. There is such an association. It's interesting. All the years I was dean at this institute, there were never any courses on prenatal psychology. Prenatal psychology is a huge field. Prenatal psychology and health, a huge field with literature, with research, studies, theories. And memories, people can remember everything about their prenatal existence. You have to go into a hypnotic state. Not drugs, no drugs. Just go into a hypnotic state to recover the memories. So, in the cartoon there were 2 fetuses hanging side by side, maybe they were twins. And one of them has a little thought balloon that says, "What happens after birth?" The other one says, "We don't know, nobody's come back to tell us." See that one? That's an interesting joke. See, that has a depth charge to it. Has one level and then another level. Nobody's come back to tell us. So, and that's the most ancient That's the most ancient tradition of using psychedelic substances. That's the mystery religions. That's elusives. Preparing for dying. But how do you prepare for something you don't know what it's going to be? Well, you can only go by what others have said. And there's some kind of intuitive, and of course you don't have to wait. The idea was not to wait, but to go there before. And so that's a whole other psychology, you see. You can't just treat it like regular psychology. You can't do double-blind placebo-controlled studies on this. This is where psychology and science shades over into spirituality and religion, and, you know, you got to respect those boundaries. Don't do double-blind placebo-controlled studies of religious experience. I think it smells bad. I don't like it. I think it's inappropriate. It's unnecessary. It's unnecessary and disrespectful. Let people have their own religious practices, their spiritual practices, and their belief. Don't interfere with it. But if people ask for help, be available to help, as asked. Am I raving? What's the time?
We got time. How about another question?
There's a hand over there.
There's one in front, one in back, one over here.
Find a microphone.
Hey, Ralph, can you hear me?
Can you speak a little louder?
Yeah, sure. I think one of the big questions that isn't being asked or isn't being discussed is the plausibility of Terence McKenna's stoned ape theory, that we actually evolved, into human beings with the use of psilocybin mushrooms.
His what theory?
His stoned ape theory.
Oh, the stoned ape theory.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's a great theory.
I come to a lot of these, events, a lot of these talks, and it seems like this is almost like the elephant in the room sometimes, because we talk about how effective these medicines are, but we never actually discuss our own evolutionary history or relationship with these medicines. And I was just wondering if you cared to speak to that.
Well, Terence McKenna was a great friend of mine, and I think the stoned ape theory is as good a theory as any other about evolution. I mean, there's no way to prove it, nor is that the point, you see. You're not really trying to prove anything. Well, people do argue about, scholars argue about did the Vedic people, have soma, and was soma a mushroom, and which mushroom was it, and all that kind of thing. But and the thing is always like the generalization, you see. Psilocybin mushrooms do stimulate the language centers. I mean, that's been proven in double-blind placebo-controlled studies. So you've got chattering monkeys that start to think about, start making words and singing, for example, singing. A lot of biological researchers think now singing came before talking. And they're singing and drumming and da-da-da, just like those ayahuasca guys, chanting and singing. And then at some point discovering symbol making, because you have to have symbols in order to identify the different plants. Then you take this mushroom, you get this kind of thing, and then you take this other mushroom, no, it'll make you dead. That's very important to be able to identify the different plants and mushrooms, and you have words for that. So it's all tied into the development of language. And so that makes a lot of sense to me. Now, whether it's, the key to human evolution, I don't know. I don't think there's probably one key to evolution. There's probably lots of keys to evolution. Were you the same person that just asked that question, or are you asking another question?
No, I wanted to comment on this.
Oh.
Yeah.
There's been someone over here with their hand up. Hey.
So yes, Terence McKenna's theory, I think, is great. It's a good theory. We need more theories like that. And it's critiqued by people who have never taken mushrooms. So they have no basis for critiquing it, you see. I think scientists who have not had those kinds of psychedelic experience should not be mouthing off about what it is, because they've not looked through the microscope. It's like people who haven't looked through the microscope, like the priests in the Middle Ages, or didn't look through the telescope. They say, we don't need to look through your stupid telescope. We know that there aren't any moons around Jupiter, because otherwise, the church would have said so. You disqualify yourself unless you've made the observation yourself. That's an issue. But Terence didn't care about that. he was far too savvy to be bothered for that. I think his theory is great. I also think his theory about mushrooms being intergalactic spores left by advanced civilizations from other galaxies, I think that's very far out and seems very plausible to me. Why should it not be, you see, considering what we now know about the vastness of the universe and the many worlds and the galaxies and the galactic clusters? Why should that be so unheard of and so unplausible that some useful method for stimulating, the mushrooms definitely stimulate language development, stimulate brain development.
So I was wondering if you could talk more about the responsibility that comes with expanding your consciousness with psychedelics, especially when it comes to tapping into the collective consciousness. I really liked the example you gave of you on ayahuasca and tapping into the Civil War pain in Salvador. And how does one prepare for that kind of experience of tapping into collective pain and becoming a channel for a large amount of pain like that? Like, what is that responsibility and how does one prepare for it?
What is the responsibility in a moral sense when we tap into the kind of stream you did of consciousness when you were feeling the genocide happening in Salvador? What's our responsibility and preparation for something like that? And perhaps what to do with the aftermath and how to integrate. Is that clear, Marie?
Yeah, how do you prepare and how do you also deal with that?
Well, exactly. That's where it all comes down to preparation, you see. What was the... when I participated in that particular group, it was like most of the groups, and that people didn't have any specific preparation. And that's why I now emphasize in the book Alice for Awakening, the more specific your preparation, and therefore the intention of what you're doing, then the more specific the answers you're going to get. If you don't have a specific intention to heal something specific, or to find out something, or to know, or to learn something specific, well, it may or may not happen. Now, in the case of trauma, for example, it's obvious the person wants to heal the trauma. But in the case where you're just exploring, then, what are you exploring? And so, yes, suddenly tuning into genocidal warfare going on in El Salvador, that it would raise the question of, like, what am I going to do about it? But that could be in any state of consciousness. You could just be reading a book and finding out about it and then being outraged and shocked whether you're a Salvadoran or not, and then figure out, well, what am I going to do about this? You suddenly, tune into this information. Maybe you all saw a documentary, so in the first place, you realize the substance is making you aware in a very visceral way of our interconnectedness. Not just we have the information, but we can actually experience it. I'll give you another example. This one is actually hard for me to talk about, but here it is. So, I was taking a psychedelic substance. I don't need to say which one it is. It doesn't matter which one it is, actually. And this was at the time when, you remember, this was about 5 years ago. There was a woman, an American woman, who was in Israel, Palestine. She was protesting the Israelis building a wall. And she was run over by a bulldozer. Remember that story? Yeah. About 5 years ago. So I took this substance. I had read the story, of course, and I became the girl. I was run over by a bulldozer in the mud. I felt the destruction, the whole thing, the feelings, the whole thing. Totally unexpected. Just because I'm a human being and she was a human being, and I had the emotional resonance just like other human beings. But normally we wouldn't have it like with that intensity, you see. That's why and that's one of the reasons why in the shamanic cultures also they don't just go into these experiences. They do a lot of preparation. The shamans do a lot of preparations, you see. And in fact, they have to go through this. They go through this long training. They have to protect themselves, because if they take on the stuff that the clients are bringing, they'd be dead. In fact, sometimes they do die. So they have to connect with the spirit. How do they do that? They connect with the spirits. The shamans say, I'm not doing the healing. It's being done by the spirits through me. And that's a very difficult lesson for Westerners to learn, because Westerners don't believe in spirits. How can you let spirits heal something if you don't believe spirits exist, you see? That's a big obstacle. But it hasn't been proven that they exist, all right. Okay, well then you probably shouldn't do shamanic work. So it's challenging in that way. Shamanic work is not fun, necessarily, not at all. Recreational drug use is another story. In my book, I really don't include recreational drug use, not because I'm opposed to it, but because it's not that relevant to using these substances for personal growth or healing or acquiring knowledge, like that. Recreational drug users don't going to read a book about preparation anyway. Take acid and go dancing. It's okay. As long as you're not hurting anybody else, I don't see why anybody should be concerned about it. See, I believe in the abolition of all drugs without victims. Crimes without victims should just be abolished, period. We don't need crimes without victims. We have enough crimes with victims. And we should take care of the victims. And the criminals, make sure that the criminals are punished appropriately. Not worry about people's drug habits or sexual habits. The drug habits and the sexual habits are people in the private sphere. And the state and the government should stay out of it. In that sense, I'm a libertarian, not in some of the other sense that the libertarians have, which is kind of nutty. But in that sense, I think they're absolutely right. This is the private sphere. As long as it's not interfering with anybody else, it's none of your state's business. And it should remain that way. That's my political rant.
Well, we have another question over here.
Doctor, in honor, Mr. Metzner. You talked about palliative care. My experience is that psychedelics will put you in touch with spirituality. And so I think it's really hard if you take that not to have an experience like that. So I think that for that reason it's a good substance to take toward the end of life if you've not done any kind of spiritual work. But have you thought about, we've talked about this, and it's been a fascinating discussion about how the psychedelics, how they're alike, and then how they're different. Could you talk any more? Have you thought about comparing, contrasting psilocybin, LSD, MDMA?
Well, no, I agree with that first part of the statement. I don't think psychedelic drugs put you in touch with spiritual realities. They can.
No, they don't.
No, they can. It's not a drug effect. Charlie Manson took LSD and committed mass murder with it. The CIA gave LSD to people and committed brainwashing with it. The drug does not produce a spiritual experience. People can have spiritual experiences facilitated by the drug. They can also have them without a drug. They can also have drug experiences that are not spiritual at all. See, it's very complicated and difficult to talk about. And when you have a spiritual experience, it's not a drug effect. I mean, of course, it's like, but that's why these drugs are not like any other drugs, you see. I take the tranquilizer, I take Librium or Quaalude or whatever it is. They say, well, it produces this state of well-being. You can't say that. Somebody asks you, what does LSD do? Well, you have to say, well, it depends on the setting and your belief system and your history, and as well as the drug, of course. But I think the differences between the drugs are relatively insignificant. the differences between LSD and mescaline, psilocybin, mushrooms, all these ayahuasca are relatively insignificant. Now, MDMA, I think, and pathogenic drugs, because they don't produce any visions, is a different category, somewhat a different category. And for that reason, particularly, it's extremely useful and most valuable. Another reason why it's extremely valuable and why this strange effect, that I coined the term empathogenic, and why you have this rave culture where people take ecstasy and they dance and they're by the thousands, and you notice something? Nobody feels threatened by anybody else. Women don't feel totally safe. Because why? Because MDMA secretes prolactin, and prolactin is the nursing hormone. It secretes prolactin and oxytocin. Oxytocin, cuddling hormone. Prolactin is the nursing hormone. You feel like a nursing baby. And it's not a sexual experience. And MDMA, actually, men often can't get an erection. In fact, I know studies of people that went to shamans, ayahuasca shamans in South America, and then they went, this one woman, well, I won't laugh about it, she's a client of mine in therapy, so she went to South America to take ayahuasca with the shaman. And the shaman was, of course, having sex with all the American women that came down. And she brought him MDMA, an ecstasy, and said, this is our, ayahuasca equivalent. He took it, he said, he hated it, because he couldn't get an erection in order to have sex with her. Because people with ecstasy, they just want to cuddle, you see. They don't want to have sex. It's like a nursing infant, just cuddle close, be close, touch, smooch. That's why people feel safe with it. You can dance with 2,000 other people, all high on ecstasy, and feel safe. Women feel totally safe. Nobody's going to come onto them. But they may cuddle, or they may just be happy playing around, enjoying themselves and dancing. So in that sense, it's a real gift to society. And good in therapy too, you see, because therapy, sexual feelings in therapy is a definite drawback. It's a no-no. It's a problem to deal with for the therapist and the client. And this is completely out of that, you see. So maybe they're awaiting our own development of some kind of integrity or something. Some kind of change in worldview. There are now people who are experimenting with extremely small doses of LSD, they call micro doses, where you don't really go on a trip. A classical trip is like there's a beginning of the trip, and it lasts for a certain duration, and then the trip ends, and you come back to normal reality. And people use these micro doses. And Hoffman did that himself. He told me he was taking 50 micrograms or 30 micrograms or 10 micrograms. Most people would say, well, it's nothing. But he said, just to help me think. Now people are taking micro doses of LSD and mountain climbers, climbing up the Eiger North Wall, or doing like extreme skiing. Not to be recommended to ordinary people who are not trained, you see, but highly skilled people who are highly skilled in sensory motor skills might find it are finding apparently. And they're not writing about it, and they're not publishing it for obvious reasons. Finding that their attentive possibilities can be greatly enhanced. You see, it requires a certain... So the possibilities are huge. But as I said, I think society at large, I think the most useful thing for application for LSD and psilocybin would be in the treatment of, for MDMA would be the treatment of trauma. For LSD and psilocybin would be in the preparation for dying, and also in the treatment of addiction. And I think for the treatment of addiction, see, there were like 6 alcoholism treatment centers with LSD in the 60s before, in Canada and North America. 6 different clinics where you could do LSD treatment of alcoholism. See, consciousness expanding drugs are the natural treatment for consciousness contracting drugs. The addictions are consciousness contracted states where you're focused on, getting the drug, getting that same drug and that same drug and drink or drug or whatever it is again and again and again. And therapy with addiction involves expanding consciousness. So I think just like there were these alcoholism treatments in Canada and other places, I think I could envision and alcoholism is still a huge problem, a huge social problem. And I think the better from the most socially beneficial thing would come from a treatment center, again, set up in Mexico, because you don't have to go through so many regulations. Mexican doctors are good doctors. You can just find many knowledgeable, experienced doctors in Mexico just as you can in the United States. They know what they're doing. They don't have this overweight of regulation and stuff. So you could, like you do now, you could have people getting treatment. You could have alcoholism treatment center. And it should be part of like a 2-week program, where you have the detox, and then you have all the dietary changes, and you could have yoga and dietary changes and herbs and medicine like that, and then maybe 1 or 2 treatment programs, treatment sessions, voluntary, of course, to those who wanted them with psilocybin, which is shorter acting rather than the 10 hours need for LSD, and just 4 or 5 hours for psilocybin for those that wanted to, I think, and integrated into a 2-week program by people who can know it. And there's lots of people who are knowledgeable about running those kind of sessions. That would be, I think, it will give you the biggest social benefit of these kinds of programs, and not that difficult to do. It costs a lot less to do it in Mexico than try to, all the regulatory hurdles that you'd have to go through in the United States.
Well, we have time for one more question. And there was a question that was on the floor here in the front row.
Oh.
Or wait, why don't you take the mic?
That was me. I heard you say we should give the double-blind controlled trial a decent burial.
You should what?
That we should give the double-blind controlled trial a decent burial.
To the what?
We should give the double-blind controlled trial a decent burial.
Oh, yeah, well, yeah, but, it's not up to me to do that.
Right.
Yeah, it's what people want to put, it's a shame, it's a waste.
I'm just wondering, though...
And I feel sorry for the poor doctors that would like to do the studies, and the doctors, who want to be healers, and they're put into this horrible situation. They can't use the method that they know. And they not only know that can be healed, it has already been proven that can be healed, and they've already experienced it on themselves, and they're not even allowed to admit that. In fact, if they admit that they've experienced it themselves, they're automatically disqualified. And I think that's backwards. They would be disqualified if they haven't experienced it. So that's what we're up against. That's what we're into.
Is there anything that can be commonly recognized as a scientific methodology that could be used more appropriately to look at this?
Yes, I think that, as I mentioned, the translational model is from applied psychology. It's from applied psychology, where you have certain scientific findings, and it's a systems view. You look at systematically all the communities, all the stakeholders, what they call the stakeholders that are involved in this. The doctors and the medical people and the regulatory and and the safety and the police and all of those factors. So it's organizational and people that are really knowledgeable in the different systems of government at every level. Involves a lot of talking, a lot of meeting, a lot of bureaucratic maneuvering like that. But that's how it's done. Go for it. It's worth it. It's a systems approach. Applied systems approach. How can we develop systems that can apply these models? Forget the double-blind placebo control. Well or not, do it in order to prove that, now we've proven it. See, but that's the thing that gets to me. Now we've proven it. And the veterans, okay, so you've proven MDMA, and that involves 2 fantastic therapists, Michael and Annie Mithofer, who stay with the person for like 6 hours or 10 hours or overnight and the night before. What therapist can afford that? No therapist can afford that. So the application possibilities are 0. But on the other hand, see, I was talking to somebody who's in this audience about this. And I said, well, you know, it's so ridiculous. The people who are doing the MDMA studies, in which I included myself, were with war trauma. Well, I don't have a war trauma. I have other trauma, but I didn't have a war trauma. The people who should be working with war trauma, traumatized people, are other people who've had war traumas, of which there are lots, millions of them, billions of them. And that's the AA model. Previous alcoholics who cured themselves of their alcoholism are the best people to work with current alcoholics who are trying to cure themselves of their alcoholism because they've been there and they know what it takes. And that model, see, that's a social model. It's not a medical model at all. It's a social model. And that, what this friend of mine pointed out, is in fact what they're doing. Because it's actually easier for the average war veteran to get hold of MDMA than it would be for the average psychiatric researcher. MDMA is a ridiculously cheaply available drug. You can buy it on, you know. And of course, there's always the qualification where it may not be good quality, but hey, you know, government researchers aren't the only people who know how to make a good quality drug. I'm not telling anybody anything they don't know already. Well, that's a good note to end. Thank you very much for your attention.